All right, so for our final PowerPoint presentation, this will be a short one today, and then I'm also going to scan a chapter for you to read on some of the environmental issues that the Far East is dealing today, especially in Siberia, about forests and a little bit about water. So a short PowerPoint presentation and then 13, 14 pages of a book, and then you're done. I want to make sure that you have time to finish other things in your classes and here and in this class this week. So just some concluding remarks about the Russian Far East as a whole, and just discussing the Far Eastern question as a whole, is this idea of whether it's an outpost or a window. Now, it had been known as an outpost for a long time, but now people have started to call it a window, especially after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And the change really came in 1986 when Gorbachev stopped in Vladivostok and he proclaimed a new era of engagement with Asia and the Pacific. He then talks about the East being this brave new world, like Aldous Huxley talks about. And there was even talk of making, excuse me, some of the river valleys into what people said the new Hong Kong. So there are really these extravagant hopes for the Far East, but like we've known from the start of our class, there kind of always has been these extravagant hopes. For over 100 years, there's been talk of making the Priamur region a new California, down there by Blagoveshchensk and places like that. In 1885, a Chinese traveler thought that Vladivostok was going to be the new Shanghai. To Korean farmers, the Primorye region looked like a promised land because of the great soil down there. And a Tsarist official in 1909 even predicted that 100 million people would live in the Far East by the year 2000. Now we know that's obviously not the truth, but the point is that there's always been this very optimistic look at what the Far East could become. But the experienced Far Easterners knew to be skeptical about their potential. However, even few were ready for the economic woes that happened that we discussed at the end of the 1980 into the 1990s of anyone who stood in bread lines or saw inflation eat up their savings or went for days without heat and water might have wondered at these predictions. A few optimists still thought that privatization would turn the East into an economic powerhouse. But in order for that to happen, there needed to be access. So after Moscow abolished frontier zones in 1989, foreigners flock to the Far East in numbers that were never before seen. Chinese people fanned out from nearly 40 new open entry points. Japanese, Koreans, American, Taiwanese businessmen began moving in between Vladivostok and Chukotka and Khabarovsk and Komsomolsk on the Amur. All of these places are starting, even up into Okhotsk and Magadan, they're starting to create these ventures that we'll talk about and trying to connect these cities economically. And also people are coming in from the west on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Journalists begin poking around Kolyma. Missionaries from all religions from all over the world come in. Big game hunters hire army helicopters for airborne safaris. And obviously these men are very good at that because they used to be frontier guards. So they were using the same techniques that they used to find illegal immigrants in the area, to find Siberian tigers and bears and other big game from their helicopters. Officially, the Far East was open officially on the 1st of January in 1992, and Vladivostok personified the Far East's quirky accessibility. When I say officially open, it means that in 1992, it was still the Soviet government, but the waning Soviet government officially opened the borders to foreigners in the Far East, even though they had already been coming in. Washington, Tokyo, Seoul, Canberra, Australia, New Delhi, India, all of these countries established consulates in Vladivostok, and they quickly overwhelmed the communication and electrical systems. There's not enough infrastructure to support all of these people coming into places like Vladivostok. You also have journalists, diplomats, businessmen, mariners, students, Peace Corps volunteers, missionaries, tourists. All of these people are coming in and they're playing musical chairs for the scarce accommodations in Vladivostok. Some entrepreneurial Canadians actually built modules outside the city and christened it Vladivostok Motor Inn. Right, and they made a fortune on the foreigners who were coming into Russia in mass. But nonetheless, for all this hoopla, the Far East remained hard to get to and quite enigmatic to outsiders. It's one thing to go there, it's another thing to live there and understand the people who have lived there all their lives for generations and generations. This is not a place that Westerners can easily relate to. And so, to cope with the shortages of manpower, capital, and technology, the gate was opened wide for laborers, engineers, businessmen, and the Peace Corps. Seasonal workers came from all over Asia to work in the forests and the factories, on construction sites, on farms. Firms from all over the world set up retail outlets in district centers. And actually, all of this was in some ways supplemented by infrastructure. New roads really supplemented rail lines connecting China, especially China, with the Primorye region, which you would then move all the way up into the Far East in that vicinity. A bridge over the Amur was created to connect the two countries, and river steamers began service again between places like Khabarovsk and Harbin. And flights proliferated from all major city centers, connecting the East and especially Vladivostok to Seoul, Beijing, Tokyo, Anchorage, San Francisco, places like that. Some people even wanted to build a Bering Strait tunnel connecting Alaska with far northeast Russia, like the one connecting Britain and France. Now, with all of this infrastructure and ability for foreigners to come in, this also means that it's easier to get out. And here is a map of where people from the Far East immigrated to once Russia was a much more open country. In principle, if you had enough hard currency, you could really leave at any time unless there was some type of unsettled account that you had to finish up. Usually that meant criminal justice system, with creditors, or with former spouses. There are lots of examples of people trying to leave, but their spouse is not letting them until they get a divorce, or won't let them get a divorce so they can leave, and so on and so forth. Russian consulates also began to streamline exit procedures, and for the first time, people who were Soviet citizens and now were Russian citizens could travel to a lot of places visa-free. And the visa-free travel from the Russian Far East made its debut as Chukotka Inuit, way up in the northeast part there of Chukotka, right up in here. The Inuit here were allowed to fly over to Alaska to meet with their relatives, their Inuit relatives in America. People on the Amur could cross the river into China whenever they wanted and go shopping. Kuril Islanders went sightseeing in Japan for the first time without having to ask permission from the government to do that, and then the government that's what a visa is. And then the government either says yes or says no to you. But all of these things are happening for the first time. Uh, Sakhalin Island Koreans got to see their motherland for the first time in well over 50 years. Some of them had never been, not some, many of them had never even been to Korea before. Remember when they were forced to go there earlier on? And an unknown, but a fairly large, significant number of Jews left Birobidzhan, the autonomous oblast there, that Jewish oblast, for Israel and the US. So the point being is that what the Soviets were always worried about, especially in the Western Soviet Union, of people leaving the country, hence they built the Berlin Wall. They didn't necessarily have to do that in the Far East because there weren't a lot of places to go. But now what the Soviets were worried about of people leaving and foreign influence coming in is absolutely what is occurring uh, in 1992 and 1993. You have a mixture of people coming and a mixture of people going. So we'll end. This will be the last slide. We'll just have 2 slides this week about the larger world, and how the Russian Far East engages with the world. And it's a very diversified place. By 1993, there were over 1,000 joint ventures with people from all over the world, involving restaurants, department stores, hotels, boutiques, computers, sturgeon hatcheries, sausage plants, even Dutch windmills were coming in to create energy. And so what these joint ventures are is just this idea that people from all over the world can come in and they can connect and they can invest in the same thing. So here is a picture of a gold mine that had investors from all over the world up near Magadan, right? What foreigners can bring is money, and they can bring technology, right? And so you really have not an untapped ecology in the Far East, but you really have an environment that has not been tapped to its full potential, just because of the lack of technology that the Soviets had. And so all of these private companies are coming in and investing together to create these companies. Amur Timber, Yakutia Coal, Sakhalin offshore oil and natural gas all came under international development. Special economic zones were created for foreign investment. And planners even proposed what was called the Greater Vladivostok, stretching all the way from Poziet to Nakhodka, which was basically this idea of urban sprawl, so to speak. There were so many other schemes that people came up with, because it was a land that was completely opened up for the first time in history, really. And so, and here's a picture of what an economic zone would be. What you do is you take all of a lot of these things. You make it so there are no permits required for hiring expats. Reduce time for obtaining permits. Tax preferences, reduce time of inspections. Basically what these economic zones did was take away a lot of the government oversight that was so important to the Soviets. It's basically a free market zone, right? Go make money, pay minimal taxes, but also employ a bunch of people, and then in return will allow you to come and revolutionize technologically, advance things, just make the Far East much more compatible for the growing globalization and the economics that the whole world has to offer. And so what these economic zones do is they kind of change the political power politics in the area as well. So, because until the early 1990s, Japan was by far the most important trade partner for the Far East. For instance, in 1991, Japan accounted for 50% of the joint ventures, 60% of regional exports, and on Sakhalin Island, 70% of all foreign commerce came from Japan. But then you have perestroika, and then you have glasnost and the demise of the USSR. Um, and you get this Russian, with Boris Yeltsin, the refusal to give the Japanese back the southern Kuril Islands, and the southern Sakhalin Island as well. And so trade stagnated except for imports of used cars from Japan and exports of guns and crabs from the Russian Far East. So to fill that gap, China took over in 1992. They were granted latitude by both governments, and provincial authorities set up what were called border economic cooperation zones centered around Chinese border cities. And so they basically created these free economic zones all around the Chinese-Russian border, and so people could come back and forth, and local bartering, especially the brisk vodka imports, created this burgeoning trade between the Russians and the Chinese. Thousands of merchants and workers poured into the Priamur and Primorye regions, bringing enough dependence with them that there was establishing of Chinese schools in most of the border cities, even Vladivostok and Khabarovsk, because there were so many Chinese coming into Russia. There was also a normalization of relations between Moscow and Seoul, or South Korea. And so the South Koreans came in and quickly did things like build a casino in Vladivostok. They were distributing Bibles in Khabarovsk. They were one of the main groups of people who started to help electrify places like Blagovichensk on the border. And they imported reindeer horns from Chukotka. Right, it's a two-way street here. However, since it's the Russian Far East, with all of this growth aside, the internationalization of the region still faced stubborn obstacles. Infrastructural weaknesses, inflation, regulatory and legal confusion about taxes, about where people could set up shop, all of these things. Managerial inexperience, that's a big one. Now you have all of these private companies who need bosses and CEOs to run them, and there's no one to do that because nobody's done that before because of the Soviet regime. Crime, we talked about, corruption, and all of this political uncertainty played key roles. Heady expectations evaporated as a lot of these joint ventures went sour. Right, you have all of these people investing and everybody's hand in there, and then something goes wrong, and then it kind of implodes. And the fact was that the Beijing government, China, was still reeling from the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989 and did not like this quote-unquote anti-communist virus that was spreading through Russia. Right. We don't have lots of time to go into the Tiananmen Square protest, but in 1989, in the summertime, there was large anti-communist democratic protests in Beijing's Tiananmen Square, and thousands of people actually ended up getting killed. And there's the really famous picture of the guy standing in front of the tank, right? This was quashed, but at the same time, now to China's north, the greatest communist country in the world is now not anymore. And so now you have this communist country as China, and they're surrounded by capitalistic democratic countries now, and they didn't like that. And as we know, there's also a Stalinist regime in North Korea, which threw a cloud over many ventures that would not be able to come to fruition in the area because they absolutely did not want to trade with the outside world. And it would also be a mistake to assume that all Far Easterners welcomed all of this engagement with the outside world. Russian national sensibilities flared up when people with tons of money started coming in, calling the region America's 51st state, because everybody wanted dollars. That's how you traded back then. And patriotism and environmentalism also fed opposition to all of these special economic zones, right? There's this argument that not only are these people foreigners who are coming in and making money off of us, but they're also wrecking the environment while they do this, and it's our environment, etc., etc. There was also a revelation that the secret security organs of North Korea had been operating timber camps on Russian soil. And nobody knew about it until some journalists found out. And this makes the Far Easterners outraged. So you have conservatives, environmentalists, and indigenous people activists joining in opposing South Korean ventures to cut trees at Svetlaya. Svetlaya was a former Gulag camp in the Sikhote Alin mountain range. Local authorities balked when Seoul, South Korea, proposed to build an industrial park near Nahodka and populate it with Koreans who were relocated from Central Asia who were sent there by Stalin eons ago. So, remember when we talked about how Stalin just kind of divided and conquered and sent people to different places, and then they grew up there and lived there, and then their family did. So there were a ton of Koreans who were sent there to Central Asia when Chechens and Dagestanis were also sent there in the 1950s. And there were gulags down there. And then so Korea says, well, why don't you send them back and help them build an industrial park in Nahodka? And people said, well, wait a minute. Those aren't Far Easterners. And so you also get you also get signs of resentment at Chinese penetration, which really amps up amid accusations of shoddy goods and unfair trade practices. While there just was this feeling, especially about the Japanese during this time period, that they were really trying to take over and kind of create a little enclave of Japan in the Russian Far East, and people in the Far East were not happy about that. So there are a lot of people who love the foreign goods, but not necessarily the foreigners themselves. Xenophobia assumed epic proportions as the AIDS epidemic really hit the Far East hard. And so that was grafted onto the bogeyman. And the bogeyman in Russia is very important. And so they're saying, well, you know who brought this is the American imperialists. There was a yellow peril that was quite apparent when because of Chinese peddlers and Japanese fishermen and Korean loggers and Vietnamese workers are coming into the Far East, right? There's this idea that the Asians are coming in, they're trying to take over our land. And there were serious calls to bring back the Cossacks and border guards to stop people from entering the region. One newspaper article said that, quote unquote, the frontiers are forever, meaning that we need those frontiers to be closed, not open, while another proclaimed, and I quote, we would rather let the land go to waste than allow more foreigners in to cultivate it. And this also echoed the sentiment of one politician in the Far East who said that a Russian desert was preferable to a Korean paradise, right? So there's this real stigma against immigrants that is coming to fruition during this time period, because this is a mass influx of people moving into the country and into the region. And so that's kind of how we'll conclude with this idea that the Far East is absolutely a paradox, right? It's suspended between the larger Asian European continent and the ocean. It's suspended between Europe and Asia. It had been dependent on Moscow pretty much from the beginning, right? To send goods, to send infrastructure, to send money, to send people. It's vulnerable to shockwaves from Korea and China. And it's also not willing or able to rely on Japan or the US, its closest capitalist democratic neighbors, right? So it faces this problematic future. Um, and the questions prevail on, should it be an Asian first view? Um, should we look to economic growth and maybe perhaps be more closely connected to the Asian markets for our goods and services? Some people are arguing for the region to affiliate itself with an autonomous Siberia and create its own republic and its own country, right? You have this vast land, right? Russia's 11 time zones, and from Siberia to the Pacific, I can't remember, I think it's 7 time zones. So you have this vast land that is almost, in a lot of ways, culturally and economically not connected to Moscow. It's hard to do business to Moscow because of the time zones. And so there's this push in some places to create their own country, right? Creating their own state and republic. But the bottom line is, no matter what it becomes, and the fact that it will likely stay a part of Russia, the idea is they're not quite Western and they're not quite Asian. And this is kind of Russia's dilemma. And the Far East absolutely encapsulates this idea of what exactly are we? Are we communist? Are we capitalist? Are we European? Are we Asian? And should we be closer to Japan? Should we be closer to America? Is it Russia first? All of these questions that the Russian government and the Russian people deal with today absolutely is a perfect example of all of these are in the Russian Far East. So that is our last presentation. I hope you enjoyed the class, and please read the article I put up about environmentalism, and it's a short little chapter in a book, and you will be done and ready for your final and other presentation. With that, we are done, and if you have any questions, just let me know.